We are privileged, as many of us who were here last night know, to have Sarah Farmer with us. She spoke about her own early SHEP experience, as Elena just alluded to. And how did this come about that she's here? Well, we heard about her, or my colleague Amy DeHart did, from somebody in Chester. And I thought, well, we want to know more about Sarah. I know knew she'd been an intern in 2004. So I called her up, and we found out a few things as well, and found out that she had a divinity degree and a PhD from Emory University in Atlanta, and found out that she was co-directing a program for women in prison, that she was interested in education that would help people to overcome vulnerabilities and gain confidence, and found out that she was a research fellow at the Yale Divinity School, where she belongs to the same institution that James Forman teaches at. I also found out that she has written an important book, and I think there were some copies out here, but I think they're all gone now. But you can probably order copies and get a signature on a placement in the book, and it's called "Raising Hope: 4 Paths to Courageous Living for Black Youth." Well, little did I know that she would begin communicating with people, and now Sarah, maybe she might regret having said yes to come and moderate the panel, because now she's on the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium Council, to which she was elected. So we are very pleased to have Sarah here to moderate this discussion among our speakers. Thank you, Sarah.
I am delighted to be here and feel extremely privileged to be moderating a discussion. Yes, to be moderating a discussion with Professor Forman and Professor Butler and Ms. Steinberg, who I want to invite up now. And just to kind of give you what I'm thinking, so we have a brief amount of time to really delve into a very complex, multifaceted topic. And it's even more brief for Professor Butler, who has to catch a flight, and so he'll be here till about 2 o'clock. And so I would like to start by asking my own questions, and then I'm going to invite the panelists to respond to each other and ask questions of each other, and then I'm going to extend that question and answering to the audience, okay? And so I want to start with a story. As I set up the context for my question. There was a young teacher visiting a school in North Philadelphia. And the young teacher was actually observing the playground, the students playing on the playground, and a ball came and landed at her feet. One of the students was throwing it and it landed at her feet, so he came over and probably about 6 years old, 7 years old, came over, got the ball, and she thought, oh, this is my opportunity to engage one of the students. So she asked him a question, seems simple, but maybe not so simple question. And she says, what do you want to be when you grow up? And so the young boy responds quickly, I want to be a basketball player. This is not an uncommon response in North Philadelphia. And he turned and he looked really puzzled. And so she asked him, is everything okay? Why do you look like that? And his response was, I'm just trying to figure out if I need to go be a basketball player first or go to prison. His response startled her. And so she asked him again, why do you say that? And he responded, well, because all my brothers and my cousins have been to prison. This young boy's imagination has been painted by what he sees on a daily basis, his hopes for his future trajectory shaped by it. Thus, I was so excited to hear the panelists talk about imagination, because I believe that in order to restore justice, we have to restore hope. And in my own work on hope and incarceration, I propose that hope is all about imagination. It's about imagining alternative possibilities. It's about transcending the current reality to muster up some internal fortitude to see differently, to see through a lens of possibility. Hope is about imagination. If you agree with me that imagination is critical to hope, then you may also agree that hopelessness is about failed imagination. I heard this story of failed imagination even as you talk about failed imagination over and over again with the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women I worked with because of real challenges, complex challenges. It's also from these women who are my teachers that I learned that imagination, particularly creativity, is a hope-making tool. What I'm saying is that some of our young people, as well as elders' imagination, as you've already said, have been foreclosed, limited, or even given to them. Imaginations that have been indoctrinated by the distorted historical myths that you both name in your books. And me personally, and I know that the SHEP interns, we don't want to make the same mistakes due to lack of imagination, nor do we want to perpetuate the distorted cultural narratives that have shaped our current public and private imaginations. And so my questions center on the intersection of hope and imagination. Professor Forman, you talked about the importance of imagination, particularly in how people approach their responses to incarceration. Professor Butler, you talked about the need for imagination in thinking about prison abolition. And Ms. Steinberg, you talk about imagining successful reentry. And so my question is, how do we cultivate the imagination of our young people to be both critical and hopeful? How do we cultivate the imagination of our elders and those across the age stage spectrum? How do we create the connection so that diverse voices will be at the table to imagine together? That we might invite incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people into imagining with us and not for them. Might we need to reimagine what it means to be a productive citizen for women who will never get out of prison or who face the collateral consequences and generational cycles of poverty when they do get out? That we might imagine ourselves as participants in what you say as the machinery of mass incarceration and what you identify as the chokehold? What narratives must we emphasize in those imaginations? Since the American dream seems to be possible for only a few, what new dreams ought we be dreaming? And whose values should be informing those dreams? Whose values should be challenging the middle-class values of success and prosperity that has shaped our current imaginations? Lastly, Professor Forman, you spoke briefly about this, but I invite you all to say more. What is the role of artists, prophets, priests, and teachers in cultivating the imagination of young people? So basically, imagination. Hope and imagination.
No, I don't. I mean, I think that's beautiful. It was beautiful and moving and eloquent, but I don't hear it as a kind of a question that lends itself to, you know, anything that I would say now would be less insightful than what you just said.
So, well, I can say, so don't listen to their words, look at their stories, because I'm honored to share the stage with James and Robin because I see imagination at work. So James is here because he's an author and a law professor and a former public defender. but he's most famous for starting with a partner, the Maya Angelou School in Washington, D.C., which didn't exist before he dreamed it up. And it's a school for at-risk children where they learn tools to survive without going back into the system. It's been around for years. It's been tremendously successful, and it's made a huge impact in the lives of countless children and families. And again, it started out as an idea in his head. Robin, you heard, worked at Neighborhood Legal Services in Harlem, and I imagine you looked across the river to the Bronx, and if you've ever seen the Bronx, just physically, it's quite a desolate place. It's a place of hard-working people who have hard-scrabbled lives, and they're intimately involved with the criminal justice system. They have what's called million-dollar blocks. That's another imaginative project with someone who wanted to make people feel what our criminal justice system is doing. And so what these artists did is a mapping project of New York. And they isolate blocks, because just on this one block, that's how much money we're spending to lock people up, $1 million. The Bronx is full of these million-dollar blocks. And Robin wanted to make a difference. So she had this idea about holistic criminal defense. As I mentioned earlier, poor people never only have one big problem. They have lots of big problems that are all related to this moment of crisis in the criminal justice system. And Robin, with her partners, thought, well, maybe there's something we can do that doesn't just treat the current criminal problem, but looks at them as a whole person and addresses them as a whole person. And from that imagination, she has made a difference in thousands of lives. And so, you know, when I hear some of what I was saying and some of what we were saying earlier, it's easy to get discouraged. But I see two visions of inspiration, two visions to encourage your imagination. What is your Maya Angelou? What is your Bronx Defenders? That exists in this room. I can't wait to find out what it is.
Thank you. I know. Thank you.
So I want to invite the speakers to respond to each other or ask questions of each other if you have any.
I'm curious, you know, Robin, you said that we have to shrink the entire system, including defenders, and put us out of a job. And I couldn't agree more. Right? We dream of a world where there is no public defender's office. I'm wondering, in the world that we're in now, one of the things that I've been picking up is that people who are trying to fund, with more and more funders and people getting involved and getting interested in the project of challenging mass incarceration, of challenging racial disparities, of attacking the new Jim Crow. I have the impression, I don't run a public defender's office, but I have the impression that there's at least some segment of people who feel like investing in public defenders is not the right thing to do right now, because what we're trying to do is take down the system. We want to reduce the number of people that are, charged with crimes, or end bail, or decriminalize these offenses, or stop charging kids as adults. There's lots of structural things, eliminating collateral consequences, but putting money into public defenders, it's not only that it's not kind of sexy, but it's also, are you in some ways just kind of fortifying this really corrupt system. And I'm wondering, and at the same time, a number of my friends in the public defender world push back against that and say, no, you know, the public, not only do poor people need good representation now and aren't getting it, but beyond that, public defenders are the natural, you know, Paul's the exception, right? It's more normal that you would come to this work and see the problems and start to write about it and become a leader out of experience as a defender. It's going to be the rare prosecutor who is able to see the problems. And so public defenders are not just in the moment providing representation, but the next generation of leaders that are going to come up. So I'm wondering kind of how you think about that dilemma.
Yeah, I feel like it's a struggle going on in the community generally, in the social justice community, the racial justice community. The balance between getting direct representation to the people that need it most, right, and doing what we call impact work, right? And I have heard lots and lots of people going around to law schools around the country talking about what you really want to do, if you really want to make a difference, you have to do impact work. Don't do public defense. Don't do the sort of day in and day out. And I have to say, I push back against it not because, I mean, for no other reason other than the answer is yes. All of it has to be going on, right? And I think that there's a couple interesting lessons. One is that poor people need lawyers, right? They need people to stand next to them and fight against the systems in courtrooms around this country that are going to destroy them if somebody's not there, right? So that is a transformative, important, and critical thing that has to go on, right? And whether you do it as a public defender, whether you do it as a civil legal service lawyer, whether you're doing it in a housing court, people need advocacy, right? It doesn't just have to be lawyers, by the way. There are non-lawyer advocates that do incredible, inspiring, world-changing work, amazing work, right? So I don't think it's an either or. I will say that one of the critiques I probably have, and since I'm a public defender, I'm skeptical of everything, but that's just in our blood. We just look, how do you rip it down? Is the idea that impact work can go on somehow separate from being housed in the direct experience of people either doing the direct service work on the ground or people directly impacted or formerly incarcerated people. That's where I think I worry the most, which is that you have these great, big, impactful ideas and they're happening over here, and the people that are being affected by it and people that are working on the ground are over here. And the people that are funding this work, I'm not often very respectful of what the people on the ground have to say about it, either whether they're lawyers and advocates or whether they're people from low-income communities or whether they're formerly incarcerated people. There is a huge gap. And there are some people, like the Glenn Martins of the world, right, running Just Leadership USA. If you don't know him, look him up, right, and look at what he's doing, right, who has managed to figure out a way to do that. But we are all of us in this space of criminal justice reform and now are feeling the pressure of funders that we've never seen before. People that honestly, 10 years ago, if you'd said criminal justice, would have left the room and disinvited you to the next party. So that's just how that used to go. And I would say up until about 5 years ago, I know a lot of us felt like we're just screaming into the void. We were talking about stop and frisk 10 years ago, and my kids like to tell the story that the parents of their friends would never invite me to a party because I'd always start talking about what I saw, and then people thought I was crazy. And now they invite me to parties because they're like, oh, that thing you were yelling about that you kept saying you saw all the time, that actually is real. So it's changing. But with money and funders, right, also comes, and I worry about this very deeply, right? You have mega money coming into the criminal justice space right now, whether it's bail reform or with other things. And who's setting the agenda of what that change looks like and what that impact work ought to be is a little bit terrifying some days, right? When I think about who's sitting in rooms making these decisions about who's getting money. And funders have come to the conclusion that they would rather put their money together and fund fewer things, but with bigger impact, which in theory sounds great, but there has to be some connection, I think, between impacted communities and people on the ground and what's actually funneling up. And it's very much, the Bronx Defenders, all of our impact work is grounded in the client stories and collecting the data. And sometimes that means you're bringing an impactful lawsuit that is the least sexy thing in the world, right? Like bringing our stop and frisk lawsuit, that was sexy. Everybody wants to talk to us. Bringing a class action lawsuit against NYPD because they take their client's property when they arrest them, Nobody really was that interested in that. But it was about the number 2 issue that our clients talked about. So it sort of has to go both ways, right? If the impact work, quote unquote, I would argue that the direct representation is impact work, but the sort of broader systemic challenges have to always, I think, be rooted deeply in the experiences that people are having in the criminal justice system, and that includes the advocacy orders and obviously the impact of communities. I don't know. Do you fear, Paul, for all of the interest in the criminal justice system and where some of that interest is coming from, or are you hopeful about that?
I'm hopeful mainly. I'm actually leaving early to go talk to a funder in Detroit. So it's exciting, and again, it's another reason for hope. For a long time, public interest organizations didn't want to touch criminal justice, and that was true of the traditional African American civil rights organizations as well. They didn't want it to seem like the interest of accused people was the same as the interest of all African Americans. So the greatest civil rights law firm of all time, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, for a long time didn't represent black men in the South who were accused of rape. Not because they thought the trials were fair, they knew they were profoundly unfair, but they didn't want blacks to be further stigmatized by that association. And it was a lot of work getting those organizations to move to the place that Robin described. And the people who did that work were you guys 20 years ago, and us 20 years ago. So that now a lot of people understand. Hillary Clinton understood, Barack Obama understood. Kind of mainstream progressive understand that criminal justice is a civil rights issue and a human rights issue. So I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic that we can move people. You know, James has been a leader in getting us to the next phase, which is not just to be concerned about the good guy offenders, the nonviolent drug offenders, but people who are at risk for violence. When I worked at the prosecutor's office, we had an expression, any given Sunday, which is that any given Sunday, the guy who we were prosecuting, the next day would be a victim, and the third day would be a witness. So there are not these bright lines between offenders and defendants and just, you know, the regular children in the neighborhood. And so that's another area. But again, the reason why I'm optimistic is because I've seen the work done. I've seen your predecessors do the work. I've seen these lovely people do the work. So I always think about this song that my parents made me learn when I was a kid. It was the anthem of the old civil rights movement, We Shall Overcome. And this new movement for Black Lives has a different anthem. It's more rambunctious, as you might expect an anthem would be from a movement that started by 3 queer women of color. It's All Right by Kendrick Lamar. But what All Right has in common with We Shall Overcome is they're both optimistic and they're both faith-based. Kendrick says, if God got us, then we're going to be all right. We shall overcome. So again, one of the things we learned from the folks on the ground who Robin was talking about is this resilience, this going on, this, you know, survival is an act of resistance for a lot of people. And that's what we learned from the people we're privileged to serve.
Any other? If our speakers do not have any other questions for each other, I wanted to see if J.D. King or Doug Amar had any specific questions. If you do, why don't you come and ask your question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So I think this is being recorded, so I was told that there is a mic in the audience, a roving mic.
Thank you. I wanted to ask what your response is to the students who I would imagine come to see you in your offices at your law schools and say, I'm a progressive, idealistic student, and I've become convinced, you know, through my research and things, that this criminal justice system is unfair, it's cruel, it needs to be changed, and I agree that it's It's an important thing, and I want to be a part of that. But then I went and I heard these speakers, and Forman, he said the prosecutors are the most important, the most powerful people in the courtroom. And then this guy Butler talked about how he used to get up and say, I represent the people of the United States of America. And so I want to change the system, but I want to be one of those powerful people. And so I'm going to go be a prosecutor and work to change it from that perspective. For any of the three of you, how do you respond to that sort of a idea?
So I basically think that student is making a mistake in the sense that, and reading, you know, Paul Butler on this, I don't know the first time Paul wrote something down on this or gave a speech on it, but whatever it was over 10 or 15 years ago, and it's since been something that's circulated, you know, widely among law students. And I can't now remember now if it came in the form of an article or a published talk, but the argument that I make has always been that you think you're going to change the system, but the system is going to change you, because you're going to go into an office that has a culture that isn't what you just said. You know, you stood up, you sat down in the office next to me, and you said that you have the following set of beliefs. But you're going to go into an office that's run by people that don't have those beliefs. And here's the other thing. You make the mistake as a young lawyer, as a graduate, of thinking that you're fully trained. You're not close to fully trained. You learn how to be a lawyer. I learned how to be a public defender, not in law school. I learned it at PDS. And that means, you know, as you learn your instincts, Paul talked about calling, you know, that he didn't use this language, Cretan and other words, when he got there, but it's a culture that developed while he was there. And so I think that I've been advising students since I've been a professor not to do that. That is students that come in with the motivation that you just described. I have modified my position on this issue recently in the following way. I mentioned in the talk that there were a number, Paul points out, not many, 10, 15, maybe you need a third hand to count them, but not much more than that. Prosecutors who have run campaigns that are very critical of aspects of the criminal justice system. I believe now that if you can find the right office run by the right head prosecutor, and there's not many of them, to reiterate, that it might be something worth looking into. But I think even there you have to be cautious, because, you know, I said in my talk that I want to celebrate the victory of a prosecutor who's, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 steps less bad than the person that they replaced, right? That's a good thing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that person is capable of creating a culture in the office that's going to train you, you know, just basic things like what counts as Brady, right? What counts? The Supreme Court in Brady versus Maryland said that evidence that would be exculpatory to the defendant has to be turned over by the prosecution if it's in the files of the prosecutor. And I lost count of the number of prosecutors that say to me that take the stance that, well, if it proves that the defendant is innocent, then I'll turn it over. I'm like, no, if it proves the defendant is innocent, you dismiss the case. This is supposed to be evidence that tends to show. However, You're going to learn those rules in the office of the prosecutor. So you have to make sure that you find a prosecutor, a chief prosecutor, who is going to try to create a culture, or has created a culture, of disclosure, a culture that is more merciful. I believe that if you can find one of those offices, and my current hope is the guy I mentioned in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, is going to go in the fall. If you can find one of those offices, that those chief prosecutors, they actually need young people to enter that office who have that kind of vision, have that kind of courage. But it's a pretty narrow, I have to say, it's a pretty narrow step back from my original Butlerian position that you shouldn't do it. It's like a progressive prosecutor carve-out. Might be so small that it's not worth talking about, but it's there.
I mean, I always scream, don't do it. I stand up and just start screaming, don't do it, don't do it. And that's kind of what I say, don't do it, don't do it. I will say that if you can figure out a way in the communities that you're in to get experience, grow, and run for the head of the office or some high-level person in the DA's office where you actually have authority and you actually have discretion, right? The biggest problem is young prosecutors go in and no matter how well-intentioned you are, they never give you discretion, right? The bosses above you tell you what their plea policies are, what the bail recommendations are, and there are a couple of DAs that have come across in the Bronx that will whisper something to you in the hallway, don't tell anybody I told you, or I'm not going to do this, but just ignore what I said. Like, there's a few of them, but you have to be really subversive to be able to go into offices that are that well established and swim upstream, right, and be the one salmon that makes it to the top of the river. Some of you might be that subversive, that would be great. I think it's too young. I think that there hasn't been enough transformation in those offices yet. I think there will be. I agree. It's one of the areas I'm more hopeful as you see more and more people agreeing to run for DA. So if, you know, you can encourage sort of progressive people in their communities to run for the prosecutor's office and then transform the office, that's amazing. But most offices around the country still, you know, sit in the structural ways that they have for generations. And they are going to be prosecuting the people that the police bring to them, which gets us back to, you know, Paul's incredible talk about policing, right? Which is, at the end of the day, you know, the police are out there and they're going to bring these cases to the prosecutor's office. And you might be that prosecutor that sort of says, you know, I'm not prosecuting this, or like Ken Thompson, right, did in Brooklyn, where he finally just said, I'm not going to prosecute these marijuana cases. And then you have to deal with the wrath of the PBA and the police unions. But I think it's a really, really hard thing to do still at this nascent moment in reform. Although, you know, I think it'd be brave and courageous if you're willing to lose your job. And I'm all for that. I've always thought people should go into it and just be willing to lose your job. And if you go in with that in your mind, that could be kind of amazing. You know, I always say that the last thing I'd like to do in my life is become a judge, not because I ever wanted to be a judge, but make me just be some local criminal court judge like the crazy lady on the bench, where for like 90 days, I dismiss every case in front of me and I free everybody on bail before they fire me. But think of how much good I would have done in those 90 days. So if you go in with that attitude, like I'm going to go in and just do what I'm going to do, that'd be amazing, right? Yeah, that's it.
So there are two sides to this debate, and you're not hearing them here, but I have actually had these conversations with elected prosecutors who obviously don't agree. So if you're interested in the other side, you can just Google my name and should good people be prosecutors is what I call it, the debate. Never a debate about whether good people are prosecutors. There are some really good people who are prosecutors, but these really good people are the folks who brought us mass incarceration and extraordinary race disparities, the new Jim Crow. So I agree with James and Robin. To me, saying that you want to be a prosecutor to reduce mass incarceration and race disparities is like saying you want to go work for Exxon or British Petroleum to help the environment. I get what you're saying, but I don't think it's the most efficient way to do it. In part because what we ask prosecutors to do, and that's the stories we've heard this morning, lawyers don't have the skills to do. So if we think about Robin's client, either one of the clients that she described, a person who suffered from drug addiction, another person who suffered from mental illness. As a prosecutor, I'd be really good. I could get you frothy mouth about the fact that this guy broke somebody's nose. I can do a closing statement where you want to put that guy under the jail. But what about his background? What about the fact that he came from extraordinary trauma and mental illness? As a prosecutor, I don't have the skill sets to know what the appropriate criminal response, how does that translate to this number of years in jail? It's just something that people here who are sociologists or historians or theologians, you know a lot more about that than I do.
I just want to follow up on that last thing that Paul said. I think it's really important and take another little kind of twist on it. And this is half why I think it would be so hard to be a prosecutor in the day-to-day, but also half about why it's so great in my mind to be a defender. So, Paul said, imagine that case, and you've got somebody that's been harmed, an act of violence that's been committed, and then you have somebody that has a complicated background. And then you have Robin that comes to court and presents some extenuating circumstances, and Robin also finds an alternative. Maybe she finds common justice, right, which we talked about earlier, restorative justice program, and is offering that up to the court. What I think is so hard about being a prosecutor is that it's your institutional role to bet against human nature. It's your institutional role to bet against your fellow human beings. See, because here's the thing. The prosecutor, let's imagine that it's Paul. The defense attorney, let's imagine that it's Robin. Nobody knows, actually, what's going to happen if Robin's client gets into common justice. We don't know. Nobody knows. Some people are going to make it through and succeed. Again, they're going to come out and face all these structural obstacles that then Robin so brilliantly out. But they're going to succeed within the context of the program, not get rearrested, succeed within the narrow context that the criminal justice system talks about. Other people aren't. Prosecutors, it's their job, and they're trained to stand up in court and make predictions that this young man or young woman is going to fail. And I would just hate to do that every day, all day long. The defense attorney has a little more information, often a lot in a good office, about the person on trial. But the bottom line is people are going into court with files and maybe a few interviews, and they're making bets, they're making predictions, they're making arguments. And the thing I love actually, I think the most of all about being a public defender was the fact that it was your job to go into court believing that this time for this client, it's going to work. They've told you that if they get into this drug program that they're going to be able to kick the habit. And it's your job to believe that and to fight for that. And that's the thing that I have to say I always thought is so weird when people talk about how it must be negative or dispiriting to be a public defender. I mean, it is in the big structural way of you face all this injustice. But in the day-to-day, it's inspiring because you bet on the capacity of your fellow human being. And that is so life-affirming.
And it's also, I think that's a great point. It's also a lesson I think you carry through in your life, which I know for me has been really helpful, which is, if you spend your life toiling in a world where what you're looking for is understanding and context about why something that somebody did that might be something that we're not really approving of as a society, you're searching every day for all the other stuff. It is the most profoundly optimistic job you can possibly have, right? You're looking for but he's a fantastic brother to his little sister, right? But she is an amazing mother, right, to her foster child, right? Yes, I know she's charged with this one incident in this one moment of time, but let me bring to you the positives, and let me bring to you the strengths and the assets that this person also brings to the table, which, I mean, nobody in the system does that with the defendant. Like, nobody wants to talk about the assets, ever, right? And I always think it's really strange that you would choose to be in the prosecutor's side where all you look at is the most miserable moment in a person's life. Like that is what you focus on with this myopic sort of laser vision about, I define this person by this one moment in his or her life where something bad or she or he did something that we don't approve of. And that's a really interesting, different worldview. And if you're thinking about how you want to live your life and who you want to surround yourself with and who the people are that you want to fill your life and fill your heart, right? I would always want to go with the people that are looking for the assets and the positives in humanity and not sort of defining people in this very narrow lane by their own worst act in a given moment, which we have all had.
So Professor Butler has to leave in 2 minutes. Is there a 30-second question you want to raise before he leaves? If not, I would invite him to say any final words before parting.
I go to a lot of these. I'm really inspired the way I am today by you all and by these speakers and by Harlan's good work. So thank you. This has been a real privilege.
Let's give Professor Butler.
Oh, wait, Paul.
You just saved his life. That would be good.
Okay, at this moment, Doug, do you have a question you wanna? Okay. So now I want to turn it over to SHEP, interns and faculty, staff. Do anyone else have a question in the audience? If you have a question, just please stand and someone with a mic will come to you.
So I heard you talking about how if there were fewer public defenders, if you shrank the system, it would get better. My sociology advisor is very focused on incarceration, drugs, and addiction. And one of the things that she always says—
In a downward trend, I hope, right?
Well, yeah. Yeah. That's her sociological field of study. But she always said that if you build it, as in a prison, they will fill it. And I wanted to know if that was the case in what you've experienced, and if you can speak to that.
I mean, I think for a very long time that was true. I wonder sometimes whether the uptick we see in women's incarceration, nobody can quite pinpoint what that's about. And sometimes I do wonder, which is we're decarcerating men and we're now beginning to incarcerate more women, and are we just, exchanging who we're putting in prison, right? And that's an interesting question. I think the build it and they'll come was always true, but I see some things changing around that now. I actually think there are projects going on in different places in the country where, prisons are closing and they're being turned into gardens, for example, or farms, or things that are sort of sustaining and hopeful and joyous. And I think those movements are really interesting, and I think, when I say shrink it, and I say shrink it really easily because if you accept the fact that 85% of the people coming through the criminal justice system at the state level in this country are coming in for junk. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. It is conduct that all of us have engaged in. And we're just deciding that that's what was going to fill our system for the past 30 years, right? And so it is Black and Latino and predominantly young men, right? Coming from low-income communities and low-income communities of color. If we just looked at that and just said, look, we're not going to police that anymore, right? We have this conversation in New York all the time. It's like, why do we even have Rikers Island anymore? 85% of people coming into the system are charged with minor misdemeanors in New York City, right? That is the reality of what the criminal justice system is and who's being arrested and shoveled into it, right? We don't have to make those arrests. There are a million ways to resolve what are community-based problems in ways that don't involve handcuffs and police cars and arrests, right? So you could very easily shrink the system. But there are, and I think this is what you're alluding to, there are underlying that build it and they'll come, there are underlying deep-seated economic interests at stake here. And it's why when I joke and I say, I mean I'll give up my job if you downsize, like all of us are going to have to give up our investment in either our jobs or the unions that hold fast, the corrections union, the police officers unions hold fast, wield a lot of power in different jurisdictions. But there are so many interests involved in keeping the system at its level that dismantling that is going to require people to actually step off of their own personal interests and their own investment in the system, even if they don't want to admit they have it, which is why I always point out public defenders first so people know I mean us too. I mean all of us, right? All the systems should shrink. We should be closing down courtrooms, closing down prisons, reducing prosecutors, staffs and public defenders, and getting the system back to where it was, 40 years ago, which was, really looking at things that we valued as potential conflicts that might involve policing responses, right? I'm still not convinced that jail is the answer to any of that, but we should be able to downsize the entire system if we're really looking at it.
And just to connect, so, Robin, earlier in response to the prosecutor question, she made the point that, well, maybe if you go in and you do something else and you're a public defender or you're a civil rights litigator and then you come into and you run for office or you get appointed as that might be something that's worth considering. And I want to take that point and combine it with this shrinking point and give you a story on this. So in DC, after 30 years of just buying into the same madness as the rest of the country, in this weird, odd, quirky moment, a mayor that wasn't especially progressive asked like 4 candidates to be the head of the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, right, the Juvenile Justice Agency, and everybody said no. And then finally, like out of options, asked this guy, Vinny Schiraldi, who was a social worker in DC that I had known as part of the campaign to close this place, Oak Hill, that I described earlier to y'all in the talk, this dungeon. He asked him to do it, and Vinny says yes. So all of a sudden, Vinny's in head of this system. And he came in at exactly the time when, again, because of the grassroots advocacy, that was essential, there was a moment in the city when there was intense pressure to close this 200-bed facility. Vinny, as head of the agency, knowing exactly the point that y'all are both talking about, said the new facility should be 60 beds. And people said, well, that's crazy. The old facility is 200. And he brought out numbers and did whatever he did to, crime, juvenile arrests were declining. A lot of the people that were there, even in the 200, shouldn't have been there. He made the case. And so the city built a 60-bed facility. And it's a facility that I happen to know very well because my school, the other thing that Vinny did was he asked my school, he said, the heart of this facility is a school and it's terrible. And y'all run a really great school for kids from the juvenile justice system in the community. Will you come and run the school? So we now run the school. So it's a much smaller facility that's much more humanely constructed with an excellent school. It is still not a place that any of us would want to be, and it's still a place that I think we should shrink. There's lots of things that I would do to make it better. But he recognized this question, and he told the judges, and now they send people to court and they say, well, we don't have any beds. So the judges, you got to find, so, they put them in a shelter home or some sort of less restrictive. And I was in DC yesterday and there are 32 kids in a 60-bed facility, which when I was a public defender, there were 200. It's the same city.
Wow. Do we have another question? Please stand up if you have a question.
There was a woman over there.
Just a second. Someone's bringing a mic.
Hi. Not very good with these. I talked about being a public defender as inspiring and looking for the good in people, which I agree with everything you're saying. I'm just wondering if there are ever cases or situations where that's difficult or that you can't see that good because the situation's so egregious. So when is it hard to do that, I guess?
Yeah. know, I think I might be dead inside. I have to be honest, and I mean this, you know, when I first became a public defender, I thought there were a whole host of charges that would be levied against somebody that would make me lean over to my person in the next cubicle in the public defender's office and say, would you do me a favor? You take this case and I'll take your case because this one's just too hard. Mm-hmm. And I have found actually the opposite to be true. For me, it is both that the worse the act is, the more egregious, the more heinous, the more upsetting, the more morally troubling it is almost always a guarantee, very much like in the death penalty world, and they know this better than anybody, right? That when you dig deeper, right, and you dig really deep, people don't wake up and tie their children to radiators, right, out of nowhere. They don't wake up one day and do something that you read and you go, that's the most horrific thing I've ever heard. When you dig back and you sort of understand the context, you begin to understand it better. I find it actually reduces both my sense of fear, it reduces my sense of outrage, you know, other than there's historic outrage, right? But it makes me actually feel more comfortable. So I've actually never run into that situation, me personally. There are people in my office who have, and I think any good public defender office, you know, yes, we want to tell people you have to take any case with any charge, but people will make accommodations when something hits too close to home or something is just too disturbing, because every client should get somebody who is going to fight till the, you know, end for that person without any moral quandaries. But I have never had that. And the other thing I have to say is, and I say this to young public defenders, particularly feminist women who come in and sort of say, I don't want to represent somebody charged with this or this crime, you know, gender-based crime. And I always say the same thing. It's like, just step foot in the criminal justice system for 10 minutes. And the lines are so clearly drawn, the war is so clearly obvious, that you're either on the side of people in power or you're on the side of the disenfranchised. And the charge almost becomes irrelevant at that moment, and I learned that very soon. All you had to do is take a look at what was happening, right, and see, you know, literally nothing but black and brown men in New York City, literally, as Paul, I think, described, chained together coming into the courthouse for me to go, I don't care what you're charged with, I'm on this side, right? And I think that makes it a little bit easier to get through some of those, you know, those tougher fact patterns. Because if the lines are really clearly drawn, which goes to the earlier question about why prosecutors and defenders don't get along.
Same reaction. I guess one other thing that I would put on the table to consider in this regard, and this is getting into the nitty-gritty of how cases really work, but it kind of matters to explain the reactions that I think most public defenders have. So there's one category of case where it's not clear what happened. The prosecution is alleging something heinous, and there's lots of evidence, and your client and other people are saying that didn't happen. And again, all the power that Robin just described is very much there, which draws you to the underdog, to the person who's enchained, to the person that has no resources, to the person everybody in the court is looking at as if they're the devil, and you've actually learned all these facts that suggest that maybe they're not. And right, we've had in Florida and Illinois, just to pick two states, over 20 people who have been on death row, so they are supposed to be the worst of the worst, who have been exonerated, right, from death row. So you know that happens a lot, and you're fighting to make sure that your client, so in that case it's not complicated because you have every reason to think that your client didn't do it, or at least it's not clear. And so then there's no problem. In those cases, I think there's no problem fighting. Then there's the other category of case, which is super heinous facts and the evidence is overwhelming, right? In those cases, the argument that you're having in court is it's about 20 years versus 60 years. It's about 10 years. In other words, typically, almost always, with those overwhelming evidence cases, you're not going to trial. Those are cases that mostly have been resolved by way of plea. And then, to me, it's the same dynamic. The government is asking for, I've already put it out on the table. Like, I don't believe anyone should be in prison for 40 years. So when they're asking that, and our argument, our best case is like 8, 10, 12 or something, well, then it's also not emotionally challenging, right? It's easy because you've learned your client's life story, you've learned their family history, you've gotten incredibly angry at the abuse that was never, diagnosed previously. You're furious that the first time the government actually wants to do something and spend a lot of money is the moment when they want to lock them up for 10 years, when they didn't send social workers, when they didn't send counselors, when nobody at the school called, when there was no drug treatment program for the mother who was addicted, and you were in a city where there were 1 treatment beds for every 10 addicts. Like, that's what's angering you. And therefore, it's easy to fight for 5 years, 7 years, 8 years, whatever is the realistic. So when you actually get into the kind of nitty-gritty of how these cases play out, I've never had a scenario where I have found this to be troubling.
The sir behind you, do you still have a question, sir?
I did a lot of criminal defense back in the 80s and 90s, and I did some capital murder work and had the experience of being able to put together social histories of people, but we had resources that we never had in regular cases. And Robin, it sounds like your approach is designed to try to provide that for as many people as you possibly can. So my question is, it seems antithetical to the normal functioning of the criminal justice system, which relies on effective and efficient plea bargaining, maybe not effective, but efficient. And I'm wondering how much pushback are you getting from prosecutors and judges in sticking to that line where that holistic approach requires you or commends doing that for every individual defendant? Or is it militancy?
Yeah, so here's what's interesting.
Robin gets no pushback. She's loved by everybody in the New York City criminal system.
They love me. The mayor loves me. They all love me.
You will not read a critical word about her.
Not a word. Do you want to take that?
No. Sorry, I'm just.
Now I'm thinking of other people.
I know. I'm not trying to mess you up. I was just teeing you up.
I forgot the question. I got off on.
What is their reaction? So you're doing this.
So here's what I'll say. So, I'm surprised. It's a little bit how you've softened slightly on your prosecutor, right, position. I have softened slightly on my view, not about how insanely cowardly judges are. I still believe that for the most part. Not about how incredibly cruel I think most prosecutors are. I still hold fast to that idea. But I have come to understand that the default of a prosecutor and the default of a judge, partly because the work they're doing is so dramatically different than the work we're doing, is to take the most restrictive, safest route possible, right? There's no question that every judge will lean in the most cautious way they can when they are able to. And so what I've learned about them, is that they don't have enough information to make good decisions. And way many of them than I ever believed as a young lawyer, and I now believe as a more mature lawyer, actually want to make good decisions, but they're not given the information and they're afraid, right? And so we like to think that what we're able to do is, and so we don't get any pushback giving somebody more information, ever. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. But what I think you see, you see it a lot in the child welfare context where judges don't know what to do. Child's been put in foster care. They really do want to give the kid back to the mom. They can see the mom is really, her heart is breaking, but they're afraid because something bad's going to happen and then they're going to wind up on the front page of the newspaper. So more information gives them more courage, and you wind up, I think, with less draconian and harsh sentences and promises as a result. And I think they know that. And I think they don't like operating in a vacuum any more than anybody else does in their job. And they want to make good decisions that are based on real information. And so I think that's the reason we don't see pushback about providing more context and information, because I genuinely think they are craving that information. And so when you give it to them, they will often soften their opinion. And when you give them information about collateral consequences, 100%, most of them, at some point step back and go, that's not possible. And I'm like, no, so I know he got arrested for one marijuana cigarette, and so he will lose his job at the Department of Education forever if he pleads guilty to this. So if we can move a disposition that looks like that, he won't lose his job. And at first they're all incredulous, that can't be. And then, you know, when you can bring the information to them, people will also then maneuver around the systems that are in place and avoid some of those collateral consequences that I also think most judges and prosecutors have no idea they're causing. So, yeah.
And I think, and this might be a difference in where we first practiced, but I've always believed, and I've always encountered judges who, even though they do things that I find incredibly frustrating all the time, I've found at least a subset of the judges in Washington, D.C. to be open to alternatives. So Robin talked about providing more information, and for me it was having alternatives, and this is especially in juvenile court, but I think it goes beyond that. So one of the reasons we started the Maya Angelou School was because I was so frustrated at how few, we had like all these really great lawyers at PDS like scouring the city for like programs and alternatives for our kids because our clients wanted them, and there was a decent chance that at least some judges would use them if we could find them. But there weren't nearly enough actually good alternatives. And so I would say, just to harken back to the conversation earlier this morning, one of the reasons why I think it's so critical for us to build up and out the network, like it's great that Common Justice exists. It's a problem that it's the program that, like, when anybody talks about community-based restorative justice programs that take people that have been charged with violent offenses, everyone's like Common Justice. But they're like in one part of Brooklyn. So we need to expand and build out the web and the network of really good alternatives. Maybe, you know, I don't know, in Tulsa it might be that judges are like, it doesn't matter, they're not going to do that. But there are communities, certainly DC is one, and there's maybe others, and this is also why these solutions are going to have to be tied to the community that you're a part of. Like, we can come here and talk about what needs to be done, but the precise answer is going to vary a lot on where you're working, right? Where you are, and the needs, as Robin said earlier, the needs of that community. But my big pitch is that we have to push and build and develop and fund and be excellent these alternatives that we're going to then people like Robin's staff of lawyers can go to court and argue for.
Do we have a question? Please stand up. Yeah. So we have about 10 more minutes, so maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions.
So, Robin, my question kind of stems from your discussion about Wendy and how you guys kind of provided a whole multitude of legal services. And so, you know, criminal law is just one section of the law. So I was wondering if you might talk a little bit more about maybe some of the other legal issues that people that are under-resourced face, and maybe how those issues might intersect with the criminal work that public defender services do.
So, you know, our clients are almost always facing a host of civil legal consequences or civil legal problems, and because there is no Gideon, right, because there is no case from the Supreme Court that says you are entitled to counsel in most civil matters, most of our clients will go unrepresented. And that usually results in one of 2 things. Either people just don't go to the proceedings because they're intimidated by it, they don't know what to do when they get there, there's nobody there to help, they can't find a lawyer, they can't afford a lawyer, or they go and they just, you know, get completely run over by the lawyers for the landlord, for example. If you go to a housing court, it's a shocking sight. People are, you know, trying to do sort of pro se advocacy, and that's really hard to do when you're up against, you know, well-resourced, you know, lawyers in a courthouse that the judges are used to working with. And so I would say when you go into any community, The civil legal service needs will vary, right? Depending on the community that you're in, depending on the kind of policing that there is, depending on the kind of benefit systems that exist, the kind of network of not-for-profits and other civil legal service organizations, right? But what we do is we go in and we look very carefully and do surveys regularly, and we're doing them in Tulsa as well, to try to assess what are the civil legal service needs that are most needed by our clients, and then we provide those as best we can. I would say these days immigration is critical. You know, particularly in a community like the Bronx, where a third of our clients weren't born in this country and have some immigration potential consequence. Housing is a problem every single place I've been. There aren't lawyers to defend people in housing court. You're not entitled to a lawyer in almost anywhere for those cases. Public benefits advocacy, connecting people to public benefits depending on where you are and when their benefits get cut off, reinstating those benefits are incredibly complicated procedures. And whenever I say that, I always say to people, now try to imagine you spend every day of your life in the Department of Motor Vehicles in a big city, right? That's what the experience of being poor is like when you're trying to navigate governmental systems, right, that are unresponsive, that are sort of old bureaucratic hangovers. So I would say, you know, housing is critical, family law critical, in almost every context, whether that is, you know, divorce or whether that's getting your kids back once the foster care system's gotten involved. Immigration, we do a lot of work, as I said in my talk, about getting people's property back when it's been taken either in civil forfeiture or by the police department in your local jurisdiction. Those are the sort of employment discrimination, expungement work, right? Getting people's records sealed. So when we did a data dive into our clients at the Bronx Defenders, we found that 65% of clients who have criminal records that were supposed to, by law, have been sealed. 65% of the time, the records were never sealed. And so when the rap sheet comes up, that they're being punished for that over and over again, even though they were promised under the law, that would be sealed and off their record. So there's work to be done there, you know, whether it's expungement or whether it's clemency or whether it's actually just forcing the system to seal the records that they were supposed to seal by law. That's another big area. I think there is a lot of need. But in the civil legal service side, there are very few resources, everybody's overwhelmed, and there's no right to counsel established. And so it's really important. It's one of the reasons that we embedded that work in our public defender office. We just thought, this just needs to be under one roof, it needs to be a one-stop shop, we need to embed it there, and they impact each other. So if you have a housing lawyer out there dealing with the eviction notice in public housing and you have a criminal lawyer over here and they're not talking, the criminal lawyer might take a disposition on a case that's gonna hurt the housing case, right? And there are ways to maneuver around that, but if these advocates aren't working together, at minimum talking together regularly and communicating, in our office they're actually on teams physically sitting together and sharing clients so that we don't make those mistakes. It's important that those systems all work together on our end, because the systems are working together on the other side, right? The systems are all talking to each other and you know, creating collateral damage. It's just the defenders and the civil legal service advocates are not talking together in the same way, and so we're losing the bigger picture.
We have time for one more question.
Take both.
Very quickly. Certainly, we are all very familiar with the topic of health care and how we need affordable health care. But if we go back to one of the fears communities have is the substance abuse in the communities. And basically, until we can get affordable, long-term treatment for substance abusers, the fear is going to stay in communities where you have the those who are addicted, who are stealing, who are committing crimes in the neighborhood. Something, it would be great, I don't know if you all have kind of broached that thought about how do we help communities feel more secure when there's nothing really going on to help poor people who have substance abuse issues.
And so there were about 2 more people who stood up. If you could stand up, maybe we could quickly get your questions on the table, and if they can respond to them, then they can go ahead and respond. But if you could kind of just say your question really quickly so we could respect the time. I saw you. Did you still have a question? So maybe you could put the question on the table.
I'm trying to walk a mile in the state government's shoes. Arresting people, prosecuting them, incarcerating them, reincarcerating them is really expensive. Third or fourth largest line item on most state budgets. Yep. They could eliminate a lot of noise and save significant budget dollars by getting rid of the ticky-tack. I know the optics of being soft on crime doesn't look good, and I think in some of your previous answers you've alluded to why they're not being more creative, using their imagination to arresting fewer people and incarcerating fewer people, because they do have a strong financial interest to do so.
And just this gentleman right here, we'll let you put your question on the table, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Thank you. Mine is pretty quick. I live over in Charlottesville, and we just succeeded in electing a progressive county attorney. I'm an immigration lawyer, and he's already demonstrated his willingness to charge to avoid immigration consequences, which is a huge success from my perspective, but there are a lot of areas of the criminal justice system that I'm not really engaged with. I'm interested to hear what are like top 3, he's willing to sit down with me, what are top 3 sort of things that I should be advocating for that could be high impact for a local prosecutor to really sort of advance the cause of racial justice, in your opinions? I realize you don't know my community, but generally
But that's
speaking,
the answer, actually. So what I'm going to tell you is you have to talk to public defenders and defense lawyers. I think, I mean, Robin maybe knows, but I can't answer the question without, I would say go talk to the people, because it could be, we've talked about 20 things, but I don't know the top 3 for Charlottesville.
I mean, I don't either, and I agree with you, but I will venture to say this. I think this is true for any jurisdiction, which is that nobody should set unaffordable cash bail. And I say unaffordable cash bail. I think there's a lot of nuances about ending all cash bail, but unaffordable cash bail shouldn't happen. Bail is supposed to be tailored to somebody's ability to pay it. That was its point. Its historical point was to enable somebody to actually put up the cash they have, whether that's $5 or a pair of sneakers, right? It should be affordable. So there should be a presumption of release. I think, first of all, when you're brought in, we have a presumption of innocence. There should be a presumption of release with respect to any bail. And if there's going to be bail set, there has to be a showing about why. And I would suggest that it should be set in an amount that is affordable, right, that is attainable. Because really what we're looking at is when you come back to court. That's really what bail is supposed to ensure, right? So, and I think that will have huge, and that's true everywhere, right? That is one of those issues. Pretrial incarceration and pretrial detention costs are actually what are destroying most local jurisdictions and counties, right? It is the pretrial detention costs, the things that happen before there's ever a conviction, the moment when you can at least rest on the most traditional conservative notion on the planet. I believe in the presumption of innocence. I believe in a rule of law, and our rule of law is the presumption of innocence. And if we don't believe in the presumption of innocence, then let's talk about that and grapple with that, right? But you can't have it both ways. You can't believe both in the presumption of innocence and then believe setting cash bail on somebody before they've been convicted of anything makes any sense. They contradict each other. So let's grapple with that question. But I would tell them presumption of release would be certainly one thing. I don't know if anything else.
Oh, and just on the first, I'd say, yeah, I think that, the justice reinvestment movement, one of the ideas is that you reduce costs within the criminal system and you redirect those costs to what the actual community need is. So I think, for me, I'm always talking about replacing what we're doing now with something else. Because my research has shown, and everybody that works in these systems or lives in these communities know, that people are desperate for safety, and people want security, and people want the government. I'll just talk about black people. Black people do not want no government. We don't want the government out of our lives, but we want the government doing positive things to help us thrive as a community. And so what I say is, yes, let's take those dollars that right now we're spending too much on police and too much on prosecutions, too much on prisons, and let's redirect them to things that will actually help communities really be safe and really thrive. I always start with the proposition that when I'm trying to figure out a solution, and this doesn't always work because there's a few exceptions to this, but I'm always like, well, what do rich people do? Now, again, there's some exceptions. But when wealthy people have somebody in their family that has a drug problem, then people get treatment, and if the person doesn't, if it doesn't work the first time, then we don't have this idea that, well, you lost your chance at treatment. It didn't work the first time. Everybody knows when it's in their family that it takes multiple times often. So then the bed has to be available the second time. And the other thing is people look not just for a program that says, I'm a drug treatment program, but we want it to be a high quality program. There is a lot of terrible, crappy, excuse the language, programs out there that are calling themselves drug treatment programs, and they're getting public funding. So good, high-quality programming, treatment programming that's available multiple times over the course of somebody's life. Because we never ever say, well, we tried prison and that failed, so we're not going to try it again. We never say that. So yes, I agree with you completely.
And I might take a slightly different step, which is I think that unless we confront the reality that drugs are not going away, they've never gone away, they've always been here, they'll always be here, whatever it is about the human condition, it is what it is, that we should begin to look at that as a public health problem, not as a criminal justice problem. I would actually advocate that that most drugs should be legalized, that we should be thoughtful and intentional about how we allow people who are addicted to drugs, if they need to get those drugs in a regulated way that does not create crime on the street, which is really what you're talking about in communities, it's eating up communities. That doesn't have to be true. If you look at countries around the world who deal with this problem in a much less judgmental way and accept it as a public health problem, they come up with public health solutions. And yes, sometimes that means you create spaces where people can go and actually do drugs and get high in a safe environment while they're being monitored by somebody who cares about them. And that I know is a notion that we're not ready to grapple with, but I don't think we're ever going to solve this problem as a criminal justice problem. Yeah.
Well, to Ms. Steinberg and Professor Forman, you are both insightful, innovative, radical, brilliant, and resilient in your work. And I've been privileged to moderate this panel. Professor Forman, we're back at Yale together, so I look forward to partnering with you in something. I don't know what yet, but thank you so much for being here. And Professor Beckley, if you can come up and let's give them a hand, please.
Thank you.